The process of removing an entire population rarely looks like a violent upheaval. Often, it just looks like a morning commute. People stand on ordinary platforms, holding luggage, wearing formally dressed clothes, waiting to board a train. But look closer, and the bureaucracy reveals itself. Families are processed, sorted, and given identification numbers, with paper tags tied directly to the coats of young children. This presents a disturbing question. How does a constitutional system built to protect individual liberties arrive at a moment where tens of thousands of citizens are confined without a trial, relying entirely on administrative orders? Large-scale institutional exclusion does not start with overt acts of force. It begins quietly, hiding behind the familiar rhythm of paperwork and procedure. In the winter of 1941, the United States was reeling from a devastating attack on military installations in Hawaii. The immediate aftermath produced intense public panic and a frantic demand to secure the mainland against perceived internal threats. 2 months later, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This directive became the engine for everything that followed. The text of the order contained a fatal characteristic. It never named Japanese Americans. Instead, it gave military commanders sweeping, undefined authority to establish exclusion zones and remove any persons they deemed necessary. When directives are intentionally broad, they create a massive vacuum. Under the cover of national emergency, vague language allows authorities to rapidly expand their reach. Within weeks, the military translated that vague order into a massive logistical operation. A newly formed agency, the War Relocation Authority, set up processing centers to systematically register the designated population. At this stage, the government made a crucial procedural shift. They stopped trying to investigate individual behavior entirely, choosing instead to use Japanese ancestry as a permanent proxy for risk. Military officials like General John L. DeWitt authored reports defending this approach. He argued that because no acts of sabotage had yet occurred, this silence was itself proof of a hidden, coordinated threat. This completely inverted basic legal reasoning. Instead of requiring evidence, the lack of evidence justified mass detention. A justice system collapses the moment it abandons individualized assessment. When sweeping categories replace evidence, the law becomes a tool for unchecked containment. What started as temporary displacement rapidly solidified into permanent infrastructure. Internees were first held in converted fairgrounds and racetracks, housed in hastily constructed rows of barracks. Soon after, the government built 10 permanent camps in isolated inland regions. These facilities were heavily monitored, enclosed by high barbed wire fences and elevated guard towers, making it clear this was a system of long-term confinement. The civilian fallout was immediate and severe. Given only days to report, families were forced to quickly liquidate their homes, farms, and life savings. The government never formally classified these actions as a financial penalty, yet hundreds of millions of dollars in forced property losses effectively functioned as a devastating institutional punishment. Inevitably, this system faced legal challenges. In 1944, a case evaluating the constitutionality of these orders, Korematsu versus United States, reached the Supreme Court. The government's argument relied almost entirely on the claim of absolute military necessity. They maintained that the sheer urgency of the war left no room for normal judicial procedures. The court accepted this argument. In their ruling, they upheld the exclusion orders, legally validating the mass detention policy under the specific umbrella of wartime conditions. This ruling exposed a terrifying reality. It proved that a system of checks and balances can legally excuse its own suspension, giving massive institutional overreach true, lasting durability. Inside these isolated sites, the sheer scale of the confined population required structure. Over time, regulated daily routines emerged within the endless wooden barracks. An internal microsociety was constructed behind barbed wire. Internees set up their own agricultural programs, administrative systems, and schools for the young children. This operation didn't collapse under its own moral weight. It ran steadily for years, from 1942 to 1943, to 1944, precisely because the bureaucracy became highly efficient at managing it. Systems of mass exclusion rarely correct themselves voluntarily. They survive by taking extreme abnormal conditions and slowly treating them as everyday administrative realities. The policy finally met a legal breaking point late in the war. In December 1944, the Supreme Court ruled in a separate case, ex parte Endo, determining that the government could not indefinitely detain citizens deemed loyal. What followed was a painfully slow reversal. A sprawling logistical machine constructed in a matter of weeks out of wartime panic took over a full year to dismantle and close down. We often look for singular, catastrophic events to explain historical injustices, but institutional exclusion is built through the quiet accumulation of unchecked procedural choices. When a crisis is allowed to override civil liberties and sweeping classifications replace actual evidence, entirely ordinary administrative procedures can quickly produce devastating human consequences.